in the case of this.
Sorry about that.
No problem at all. That went on for about 40 years where they didn't provide proper treatment, even though the treatment was available to Black folks in the trials. We know the story about Henrietta Lacks. In my reporting, there are just so many of these examples, and it's not just historical, right? You talk to most Black folk, and they'll have their own story. They'll have a story of an aunt, a story of an uncle, of a grandpa who was in treatment for something, and they just felt the doctors weren't doing a proper job, felt the doctors may have been discriminating or may have had some biases or just weren't paying attention or felt that the patients were exaggerating. So these stories are very much in the present as well. So during those early during last fall, the big question was, vaccine hesitancy in Black and Brown communities. Are they going to take the vaccine? And even myself, my dad at one point was saying he wouldn't take the vaccine because he just, didn't know what they were putting into it. But what you saw going forward was, very heavy, I guess you can say, communication from scientists, especially Black doctors in the communities, Black scientists on Twitter doing outreaches over Zoom, doing these public forums and such, trying their hardest to really dispel some of these misconceptions and myths about the vaccine. The big one was Dr. Kizneka Corbett, who you guys have definitely seen on television, just really explaining to people, why the vaccine is important, why this isn't an experiment on people, and goodness, like these psychological, if you will, scars from this history of medical mistreatment in the US, they run very deep. Oh, hold on one second. Sorry about that. My thing is a little off, but hopefully it'll come back. But yeah, so like I was saying, in the beginning, it was really an issue of, concerns about, vaccine hesitancy amongst the Black community. And then once the vaccine rollout began, I think people were surprised that the hesitancy wasn't so much coming from, the Black community, as we've all seen now. Hesitancy, the biggest rates when it comes to people who aren't getting vaccines, who have access to it, seems to be amongst white conservatives. But what we started seeing was a different inequity, the inequity of who actually gets access to these vaccines. So it's just, you go to certain communities and you realize that, the levels are much lower because they don't have as many vaccines, or you realize that people from out of town are coming in to some of these communities and are getting vaccinated. And it was just its own mess. Plus, just trying to get vaccinated in those early days. And I wrote a story about how should the vaccines be given out? And even this was like a very controversial thing, because at first they said, we wanted to give it out to, I believe it was everyone who was like 65 and older. But the real question is, giving out this vaccine, you should really give it out equitably. And if we see that, Black folk are most likely to die from this, how do we give it out in such a way that, they are prioritized? And my goodness, the pushback behind saying something as simple as, Black and Brown communities are more like, Black and Brown people are, some of the heaviest losses to COVID-19, so they should be prioritized with the vaccine, and seeing people being like, no, that's racist, how dare you, like, oh, so you're going to take it away from all the white people and just give it to the Black people. Like, these were the comments I was getting in online and in my inbox when I was just writing about how scientists were trying to devise a plan to give this out equitably. Whatever kind of national plan they had was, we were all there during the early days of the rollout. It was tough. It was definitely tough. But one of the arguments against giving it just out to everyone 65 and older is that, a lot of the Black and Brown people who are dying from it, on the front lines, grocery store folk, people working in meat packaging, people working in restaurants and such, they weren't necessarily 65 and over, but they were at the highest risk. So in terms of, was this given out equitably in the early days, debate over that, debate over why it wasn't. So the story of COVID-19 and, the Black community, the Brown community, has been one of inequities. And like I started off this kind of talk was like, never before has it's just so glaring to everyone. You cannot deny this. You cannot deny all of the different factors that went into it, that brought us to where we are today. And I'm just speaking with doctors about, what they can do, what needs to be done to further, make sure the vaccine rollout is equitable, to make sure. And I'm curious. As I said, I want to make this kind of like a dialogue, and I'd love to hear from you guys. Did you guys have family members who were maybe hesitant in the beginning, or did you have family members and it was tough trying to track down, vaccines? Like, what was that like for anyone who also wants to share? Like I mentioned, my dad at first did not want to take the vaccine. He really was against it. I mean, luckily, I was able to kind of hammer into him the importance of it. But what really changed his mind was just seeing young people, younger folk like him in their 40s and 50s. He's in his 50s, but seeing them die from the disease. And I think that really struck a chord with a lot of people, realizing like, I think it was something as much as like 1 in every 6 Black folk know someone who died from COVID-19. But yeah, I'm curious, what kind of conversations do you guys have with family members to get them to take, the vaccine? If anyone wants to chime in, I'd be happy to hear. Oh, I think Rob is talking, but
I know, he was just saying we should encourage everyone to unmute and turn your video on and share if you would like.
Yeah, I'd love to hear a bit about, what everyone's experiences have been. Because mine from a reporter, I'm speaking to doctors, I'm speaking to people on the front line as well. But I'm curious if you guys have seen that shift in the narrative as well. I mean, during the early days, were you even curious about the vaccine? Were you even wondering yourself if I would, should I take it? And then what changed your minds? I mean, just a quick question. Is everyone here, have you been vaccinated? Are you in the process of it? Yeah. So what kind of made you guys decide to get vaccinated? If anyone wants to raise their hand or just talk. Time helped to take it. Yeah, seeing other people I trusted get it. Yeah, that was a big one. And I mean, what I had been doing a lot of during the pandemic was watching these public forums where you had experts speak to people, and listening, because this big question of not wanting to be the first in line, or not wanting to be a guinea pig it's just huge in this case. Has anyone here had trouble? Did anyone have trouble trying to get a vaccine or get one for their loved ones? During the early days, I wrote a story about just the different hoops people had to run into, whether it being I spoke to one doctor who posted online, like trying to get a vaccine for her loved ones, her parents in California. And all of these people, I think it had hundreds of comments of people saying, hey, I was able to track one down here, or yeah, I'm running through these same problems here. I'm curious, did you guys have to try to navigate that for your family members? If anyone wants to unmute and share their stories, I'd be happy to listen.
I'll share a story about your first question about family members being hesitant. That was definitely something that I experienced with my mom and a few of my cousins. It just like trying to explain that it's not a problem and that you'd be fine. They would, trying to be funny, still make some jokes. It was like, but it got frustrating as someone who's involved in science. But yeah, I mean, I'm glad they eventually did get it though, so I'm happy about that.
Yeah, I mean, especially for you guys who have these science backgrounds, and that's what I had been speaking to some PhD students as well, in terms of, I saying like, this is what I study, this is what I work with, this is why the vaccines are safe. But then you'll have someone say, well, I saw in this WhatsApp, posting, or I saw in whatchamacallit, like on Twitter, I saw this on Instagram, just fighting that medical, that vaccine miscommunication or misinformation, if you will, has been a challenge. I mean, right now, as we're moving forward, things have gotten better. I feel like a good number of, Americans have been vaccinated, and we're finally moving towards the point where more and more people are, taking their masks off and kind of enjoying, being outside and such. I'm still cautious, I guess you can say. I know I've been reading a lot about these other strains, especially what we're seeing in India, and whether or not that'll come over here. And gosh, my biggest worry is if we get a resurgence with a strain that isn't as, that the vaccines don't work as well against. And if that happens soon, and just what that'll do to people's just mental health with all of this as well. That's another issue in terms of, and I'm so happy you guys put this together in terms of combating COVID, with Black communities, because I think another thing that we need to address is just the mental toll this has taken on so many people, and what that's going to look like going forward. Goodness. I wanted to take a question that I just saw from Harshina. If you want to unmic, I saw your hand pop up real quick.
Yeah, it's super interesting to hear the US side of things. I'm actually in Ontario in Canada. And like getting the vaccine was like, I remember like all of us, all my friends, we were all looking at, this rogue Twitter account, Vaccine Hunters Canada, because there were pop-up clinics everywhere in Ontario. And like, they weren't advertising on a large scale because they didn't have enough doses. And it was a lot of like, I ended up getting it. And like, it was just like, if you had access to the internet, if you had access to that Twitter account, if you had access to a card to get there in time, you were able to get it. There were a lot of pop-up clinics in a lot of communities that needed it. A lot of like Black communities, so communities of color. So that was really good. But yeah, and the good thing is like here, a lot of the Indigenous peoples, all because they live in the northern areas, they all got their vaccines earlier, and they were prioritized, which is good because a lot of the northern rural areas don't have access to hospitals, so you need them to be vaccinated. But yeah, it's a very different, like, I just remember it was like we were talking about like, getting a vaccine is equivalent of like finding out like an undercover like speakeasy bar. Like, you're waiting long lines, you're looking at a Twitter account, you're seeing when it's open, you're like, it was crazy. It was just, it was a lot.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. It was very interesting. I'm looking in the chat here. I see that Dr. Gabriela Fernandez brought up, only specific vaccines available in specific communities. And, the problem with that was even that made people hesitant, because the idea was that, there was some news coming about was J&J, as effective as Pfizer, or was it as effective as Moderna, or, don't get me started on AstraZeneca and all of these things. And some communities felt like, why are you giving us J&J? That's like, the inferior vaccine, when, really more should have been done in terms of effectively communicating that, any of these vaccines that are, approved for use in the US are effective, should be taken. If whatever gets into your arm is what's effective. And this was actually a huge concern that a lot of the doctors I spoke to were telling me back in October, before the November, before the vaccine came out. They were saying, there have been millions and millions, even billions of dollars really spent on the development of these vaccines, but really nothing on the communication of this, of the social sciences of how to make sure people are taking it. And man, yeah, I mean, I'm happy that we're past that. And it sounds like Biden was able to get, his promise of like 100 vaccines and 100 arms, or 100 million, and it sounds like, I believe he was able to do that, but people were not optimistic when I was speaking to them back in January and February about that. Obviously this coming during an election year when we had, a president who was just very much trying to say there wasn't a problem, yet taking credit for any kind of victory that there was. Goodness, like, I really think when we look back on this period and we tell our kids and our grandkids about it, and we talk about, they're going to look at us and be like, how did your country drop the ball so badly? Because there are things that could have been done early that could have saved so many lives, and they weren't done, or they weren't enacted, or they weren't followed because of political reasonings, because of political differences, political ideologies, agendas, and all that. So it's unfortunate, but things are moving in a better direction now. I'm curious. Someone else wrote, Rob wrote, definitely also had trouble accessing the vaccine for my family, and even in April for me. Yeah, it's interesting. Trying to sign up and get these vaccines early. I'm wondering, has anyone, did anyone have to travel, a long distance to get a vaccine, or were most people able to find it close to them and their loved ones? What was it like kind of getting vaccines for you guys? Because I mean, we're in like the younger kind of part. So from my understanding, most of us were eligible probably like April, maybe like maybe some of us end of March or so. Yeah, I'm curious if anyone has any other, yeah, go right ahead.
If I can share for my area, I live in Prince George's County, Maryland, in the Washington, D.C. area. I was able to get fully vaccinated in March through my doctor's office. I lucked out because someone else didn't want to, and I wasn't in the age range at the time, but I was able to do that. And I just wanted to share that in our area, the governor started organizing these mega sites. But the thing about it, in my majority African-American county community, we had folks coming from all over the state, and mainly those in our sister county, Montgomery County. They were going all over the state to get the vaccination. So people actually in the community, because of the hesitancy and the reluctance, the Blacks weren't taking advantage of it, but surely people from other communities were. So that was an interesting, interesting feature in our area. Also, just to note, just as the end of last month, still in DC, 80% of the new cases of COVID are African Americans.
Yeah, my goodness, it's sad, and it's unfortunate. And again, it deals with these inequities in terms of like who is on the front lines, who's still working right now. I know some people are slowly returning to work, but that's because they're vaccinated. And really just how to better get this message out for to get vaccinated, but also getting the vaccines to the people who need it. So I'm happy one of you had brought up the idea of these pop-ups, vaccination sites and such, but it's still, there still is progress that needs to be done, and people need to continue to really stay vigilant going forward, because we really, in terms of just, obviously, as you just said, these cases are still happening. We're not out of the woods yet, and as a planet, we're definitely not out of the woods yet. And it's like over at STAT, we had a conference, and one of the speakers had brought up the example of like, if you have a wildfire and it's burning in one part of the woods, it's going to continue spreading. So you gotta, in order to take care of the whole forest, you got to take care of the whole community. So yes, we have to certainly take care of the communities here in the US, but we also have to be mindful of people in India, people in South America, people in parts of Africa where this is boiling over and is still very present. And if we want to make sure we're safe here, we have to make sure they're safe as well. So we're definitely not out of the woods yet, but in terms of the Black community, just the best thing we can do is continue doing what you guys are doing here, continue talking with family members, talking with friends who may not have gotten the vaccine yet, and dispelling some of these myths, and doing it in such a way where you're not speaking down to someone, but you're telling them about the science and why it's important and why it keeps people safe. I think I'm about at time, but I wanted, if anyone had any other kind of questions, whether it be about me, my work, or whether it be about tips going forward in terms of battling vaccine hesitancy or ways to battle vaccine inequity, I'd be more than happy to answer any other questions that anyone has. Yeah, there are issues also in more rural communities as well. Just really kind of getting those vaccines to the people who need it most. That's what the battle is for the next several months as well. But yeah, I mean, I wanted to thank you all for giving me the time to speak, share some of my stories, but also listen to some of yours. I think it's so powerful when we share stories so that we learn what works, we learn what we can improve on as well. I see one question over there. Go right ahead.
Hi, do you mind? Can I ask? Okay. I'm kind of curious. So with this whole idea of trust not being very strong in certain instances, some of it is obviously because of historic reasons. So in some ways, not having trust sometimes is a good defense strategy, so that you do your due diligence to figure out if this is something you should do or should not do. I guess my question is, how do you find that balance between getting people to trust something, but at the same time, keeping them vigilant so that if you were wrong about something that you were trusting, the person you're talking to does that work of being critical about the information. Does that make sense, or am I just?
No, yeah, no, I hear you. And I think the best thing is explaining kind of the scientific process here. I think for a lot of folks, when they look at this vaccine, they look like, oh goodness, like I'm not going to be one of the first people to take that. Like, we'll see what happens. I'll wait 6 months down the line and then I'll take it, without realizing that, this has been through clinical trials. There are people who have taken the vaccine already before it was available to the public. And, they've been monitored for symptoms. They've been monitored for how it protects them. They've been monitored. So, I mean, explaining to them what, a clinical trial is, explaining to them what, something being blinded, double blinded. And also, I think what's super important and what has been impactful is also showing, the Black scientists who have been a part of the vaccine creation and also a part of, its approval, along the line, people like Dr. Corbett, who I had spoken about earlier, Kismika, and there's a gentleman named Dr. James Hildreth, who was part of the FDA panel to when it came to like approving emergency access to these vaccines. So realizing that, Black folk are at the table, are helping make these decisions. I think that's pretty insightful. I think that really does help. But also, like I said, like explaining how these vaccines got to, no one going from having no vaccines in the beginning of the pandemic to having, a variety of different ones, and explaining, these have already gone through these clinical trials, I think is important. But I mean, yeah, having people make sure, telling them like, listen, I'm happy you're doing, research into this. Because that's always good to be doing research, to be reading scientific papers, but making sure that they're asking them, the sources you're getting your information from, are they reliable? Maybe sitting down with them and asking them, where are you getting your information? And I could help you, because you might have an expertise in this. I could help you kind of shift through what is reliable, what is not reliable. I think that could be helpful. Lee, I see you have a hand up.
Hi, yes, I have a question. So before I started my PhD, I was actually a high school teacher, and I used to work in a Title I school. And a lot of my friends, they reach out to me, and right now, the age group 12 to 17 that they can take the vaccine. And now they're not just dealing with like, parents that didn't want to take the vaccine and they're passing that to their kids, this information. Maybe it's not right for you to take the vaccine. So a lot of my friends tell me, what should we be doing? How can we implement this into our classroom? What can we tell our students to tell them more about the vaccine? Do you have any ideas or anything that you can share?
Just from my personal experience, what has been, really changing minds is unfortunately asking people, do you know someone who has died from COVID-19? I mean, we're at what? Are we at about 600,000 now, I believe? I know we passed 500,000, but I mean, it's also really numbing how high the number has gotten. But realizing just how many people have died from this versus, how many people, have not died from the vaccine. And I think putting those together and showing that, like, yeah, there are some people who have had, some side effects to the vaccine, but that number is so little compared to the risk you get from, being unvaccinated and having COVID-19 around. And I think, honestly, a lot of people have a lot of different opinions when it comes to the CDC saying, go without masks. You don't need masks right now. I feel like, personally, I feel like they probably said that too early. I understand why, in terms of like trying to get the country back, getting businesses, all of this. But, just an idea. I mean, telling people, we have a lot of people who are walking around without masks now. Yes, some of them are fully vaccinated, but some of them are lying, right? And you just don't know. So if you're looking to help give people a better reason about why they should get vaccinated, because, it's like, oh, COVID-19 is on its way out. Well, we have more and more people who are going around without a mask, and you don't know who's, during the early days of the vaccine, you could tell who was an anti-masker because, they weren't wearing a mask. But nowadays, a lot of people aren't wearing masks because they're fully vaccinated. And like I said, a lot of people are also, may say they're fully vaccinated, but may not be fully vaccinated. So I think that in itself might be a good enough reason to kind of get people like, you just don't know, like you don't know who around you is fully vaccinated. And, if they're not fully vaccinated, they can still very much spread the disease. So just to be on the safe side, now that we have people, the levels of mask wearing are dropping because, people are getting vaccinated. I think now that gives you even more reason to say to them, you should be vaccinated, because you don't really know who is and who isn't. So that's just one idea that might help in your case. Reyhaneh, is that how I pronounce it? I see your hand is still up. Is it?
Oh, I already asked my question, sorry.
Okay, no worries. Yeah, if there's any other questions here, I'm looking in the chat real quick in my yeah. I mean, I'm going to continue masking up as well personally, but I just wanted to say thank you all so much for just having this engaging conversation. It's great to hear from you all, hear everyone else's perspectives as well in terms of what we need to do to further ensure that our communities are safe going forward. So thank you all so much for inviting me.
Thanks, Nick. That was great. We are at time. We are going to transition into Pop Talks. Nick, is there a way to contact you off this that you might be willing to share?
So that is my Gmail, and my Twitter is just, feel free to give me a follow or to send me a DM. My DMs are always open. If you have any, questions or anything, or if you have any questions about science journalism, feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to speak with folk. But yeah, continue doing the work you guys are doing, and I'm happy this conference, this topic exists, and that you guys are all so enthusiastic about it. So thank you all again, and enjoy the rest of your week. And good luck with the rest of the conference.
Thanks.
Bye now.
Great, thank you for continuing to stick around, everyone. Okay, our next section is on COVID-19 science, communicating the basics of COVID and vaccines. And our speaker will be Dr. Chiquita Mays. Dr. Mays has spent over 20 years leading people, teams, and organizations through successful transformations in the face of those challenges. Her great passion is guiding with light and optimism to discover science-supported solutions. Her specializations are diversity, equity, and inclusion, change management, and communicating change, and leadership and organizational development. She has worked in numerous industries with various companies, including Caterpillar, Boeing, Kia, Coca-Cola, Jaye Quick Start, Toyo Tires, and Wellstar Health Systems. During the last year, she has supported WellStar's COVID-19 Task Force and DEI Advisory Council. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Chiquita Mays.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for allowing me this opportunity. Really good to be here. I really appreciate it. And I want to focus today on really talking about communicating the science and the data pieces with the Black community, Black and Brown communities, but I want to focus on really communicating science and data with emotional intelligence. COVID-19 and especially the vaccine rollout presented us with a number of opportunities and challenges, as Nick mentioned and as he talked about so passionately, and I appreciated everything that he said and that he shared, because it really teed this conversation up so nicely. And this is intended to be a conversation, so please chime in. As scientists, we're comfortable with stating facts and discussing data. However, we typically do this within a community of our peers and our colleagues and within the scientific community. But COVID and then the vaccine research presented the challenge of having to communicate the science in the research in the general public, in the broader media, and specifically in social media. And then in practical, almost in real time. So as the science and the research was happening and being done, then we had the complexity of having to communicate the results and the findings to the general public and the media. So this could present, just a lot of provocation, some division when there are varying levels of knowledge and understanding. And then you don't always know the motives of the audience that you're speaking to. So in engineering and in healthcare, our focus tends to be on your intelligence quotient or your IQ. So we tend to focus on book smarts. The research by Daniel Goleman, who is heavily associated and has become synonymous with emotional intelligence. With his book, he compares our IQ and technical skills with emotional intelligence as ingredients for our success in this area. Emotional intelligence is our capacity to be aware of and control and express our emotions, and to handle interpersonal relationships judiciously and empathetically. So when we look at all of the events over the past year plus, think about this. Emotional intelligence, when we think about emotional intelligence, think about a company like Google. Google, emotional intelligence is one of the 6 qualities that Google uses in the recruitment of their engineers. So when you think about and we're not talking about IQ, but we're talking about EQ, that's one of the 6 qualities that they look for with recruitment. So when we talk about communicating, and that's one of the things that Nick talked about, communicating the data, communicating the science was so important. Your IQ is going to change very little. However, your EQ is something that you have the ability to impact. And if you invest in it properly, and you invest in personal development in that area, you have the ability to impact and you have the ability to grow in that area. So emotional intelligence, or EQ, is critical for collaboration among scientists and the level of communication. And that was something that was so critical during this pandemic, and even all the more critical during this vaccination rollout, because we're still in the middle of vaccination rollout. Now, consider communication required within varying communities, non-academia. And let me say this, despite our hopes, communication is not one size fits all. So you cannot assume that because I'm able to communicate effectively with my peers, maybe that I'm going to be able to communicate effectively across all communities, because that just is not the case. And that I'm going to be successful in communicating successfully this information in regards to COVID and in regards to the various vaccines. So how do we communicate science and data within communities of color? Here's where we get to flex our EQ a little bit, get to flex that emotional intelligence. We must communicate with our heads and with our hearts. The first part is easy because we tend to be more comfortable in the realm of data and in the realm of science, research, experimentation. But how do we learn to also communicate science and data with our hearts? First and foremost, we have to communicate with consciousness. Know yourself and challenge your consciousness. We engage and intersect with different cultures all day, every day. We need to be aware of our own values and our own beliefs, and then challenge yourself to learn from those various cultural intersections. Listen and learn to see each individual that you encounter every day. And I can't stress enough the listening part. It is important for us to listen. Listen to why they're not willing to receive the vaccine, because that's a data point in and of itself. We need to listen. There must also be a historical awareness and sensitivity to historic realities, like the legacies of trauma and oppression against communities of color as well, in regards to health, in regards to vaccinations. And I'm seeing some comments, and I'm seeing that the chats come through, so I'm gonna toggle a little bit, because like I said, this is intended to be a dialogue. So I want to be sensitive to the comments that are coming through as well. So as we're looking at this, think about that for a minute. You have to communicate with consciousness. Is that heart piece, not just we can't just state facts and state data, even though that's our comfort zone. For most of us, that's our comfort zone. I'm checking the chat. Give me a second. I'm toggling a little bit. I apologize. So I see in the comment, Janie says, indeed, my son keeps saying they haven't told us what is in the vaccine. He gets this info from online news and other online media, and there is as much information, misinformation online. Absolutely. And from one standpoint, that has been one of the biggest issues with communication. But then how do we know that it's misinformation? What's our source of truth? And what's the single point? Where was the single point of data to receive? For the longest time, we couldn't even truly say that it was the CDC. What was our single source of truth during this time? And your son is absolutely right. And I'm going to talk about this in just a minute. Your son is absolutely right in searching and seeking information. Another piece is that we have to communicate with confidence. There's a difference between, and I want to say this, there's a difference between confidence and arrogance. And Nick spoke about speaking about the science without speaking down to people. And this is where I want to deal with this. We understand science must be tested. That's the reason for experiments. That's the reason for our research. And with that, there are going to be failures. Not every experiment is going to work. And we're okay with that. But a lot of times in the eyes of the public, that's not okay. But we have to be able to share confidently at all levels. I found myself during the pandemic also being the homeschool teacher because my children were home. So I had to be able to explain the vaccine to 60-year-olds, as well as to my 16-year-olds and to my 9-year-old twins. I had to explain it at all levels. And listen, I had to answer their questions. I had to take the time to be able to walk them through this. I had to explain to them that it was different from the flu shot that they were used to receiving. And here are some of the differences between this vaccine and the flu shot. It contains proteins that surround your cell. You know what a protein is? No, Mom. Well, they're proteins in these foods. So I had to break that down for them so that they could understand it. So we have to, and we gain confidence in our data. We gain confidence in the science. We have to communicate the science, and we have to learn to not be offended when they go back for confirmation and when they go back and fact check us, because they're going to. From COVID to the vaccine to treatment of COVID, they're going to go back and they're going to fact check us. But how many in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, let every word be established? So you have to learn to just let your guard down and not be offended. Don't take it personal. And you also have to remember the historical trauma, because we don't know what those individuals, what their family has been through. We don't know the communities they come from. We don't know what they've been through. So we don't know their stories. So we have to learn to be okay when they go back for some confirmation to what we're sharing. And we have to be okay with it. And it's okay. Finally, we must communicate with compassion. You know the saying, people don't care how much you know till they know how much you care. Here's the hard part. We must learn to temper the message of science and data with compassion. Learn to share some of your thoughts, your feelings, and your rationale behind the science and the data. I found this extremely critical during the pandemic and the vaccine communication. Our health system has the My Why campaign, where the staff is sharing their why behind receiving the vaccine. In my personal community, while the data and the science are critical, one of the most important things that I found is me sharing my personal journey, because honestly and truly, and I'm being transparent here, I started out at the beginning of COVID, I started out on the side of, oh, I'll never get this vaccine. That was me. I was that person. I'm never getting this vaccine. And the more I did my own personal research, the closer I was to, because I saw COVID so up close, being in healthcare, it was up close personal. I saw the impact and effect of it. I could not, and I was one of the first to be vaccinated very early on. I knew individuals who participated in the Moderna clinical trial in Charlotte. And so I stood very close to, and I followed their journey. And I shared that. And so it was important for me to share my journey with my community. And I found that to be more effective than probably all of the science and the research and the data that I shared. So I want to say this again: we must communicate with consciousness. Don't forget, communicate with confidence, and then communicate with compassion. So I'm going to stop here. I want to pause for some questions, some thoughts, and some comments. I'm going to go to the chat because I did see some comments in the chat. So I'm going to open that up so that I can respond to some of that. I hope this has been a little bit helpful, but I want to go and read and respond to some of your questions there. All right, Andrea says, many people of color are not interested in receiving the vaccination because of our history with receiving different treatments and vaccinations, et cetera. Yes, one of the things that I've been sharing and saying, you have to remember that. So one of the things I first like to do is I like to just listen to them talk about what they know about the Tuskegee experiment, about the Guyana experience. And then I like to share with them, you have to remember that the intent from the very beginning, the intent of those experiments was to do harm. This is a very different case. And the research for the vaccine for COVID began at least 7 years ago. So this was not something that started in March. Contrary to popular belief, it did not start at the beginning of this pandemic. This literally started at least 7 to 8 years ago. It was just in response to a different, we'll call it a cousin of this coronavirus disease, but it did not start in response to this. So this research was already in process. But you have to remember that the intent of the Tuskegee experiment was, the original intent was to do harm, to see how bad it could get. And then let's talk about this. But then let's talk about all the things that have put in place to ensure that that never happens again. So you're absolutely right. Then Tayer, I hope I'm saying that right. If I'm not, please unmute and correct me. Says, sorry. I have a cousin.
It's Tier.
I'm sorry.
Sorry, it's Tier. Yeah, he's fine.
I'm sorry. Says, I have a cousin who keeps refusing and saying she will not take it because it is not FDA approved. Oh, she keeps saying it is another flu and it's not that big of a deal, even with the death rate. Okay. She has sent my immunocompromised mother propaganda videos. Oh my goodness. She says that they are using, oh, Dr. Corbett, using a Black woman to try and get more Black people to take it. Talking to her about it, exhausting. I know it must be. As I tried to explain the science, she said it's a man-made construct. As I replied that everything else is, it's exhausting and disheartening to have conversations about the vaccine with her, that I've just stopped. I applaud you for stopping to protect yourself and your own peace. I also would recommend that you do everything possible to protect your mother. That's my next conversation. I don't recommend you pour any more energy into your cousin. I hate to sound harsh, but I'm just going to recommend that. It sounds like she's going to believe what she's going to believe, and that's okay. I've encouraged people during this time, we're not going to be able to change. This is not an effort to change, even during the whole mask period. And I heard someone mention and talk about people not wearing masks, and that sometimes it's not a matter of changing people's beliefs, But there are times when we need to talk about behaviors. So I don't encourage you to pour any more energy into that. Where you do need to pour energy is into your mother and protecting her health and protecting yourself. So I encourage you to pour all energy there. It is absolutely imperative that we protect ourselves and we protect our parents, our grandparents, our children, as much as possible, protect our community as much as possible. Those who are just not going to, that's their choice. But you protect you and you protect your mother. Okay, and if you need resources to help talk to your mother, I have a beautiful story I'm going to share. So there was, I have a colleague who's 90-year-old grandmother. She was not going to get this vaccine because, again, of the history. It's history. And so we shared a video with her because everything is how we communicate and who communicates. And so we shared a video of a doctor who is, and it's not, you know, he's been instrumental from the very start. But anyway, we shared this video and he came back and he told me, he said, my grandmother came back and she said, well, baby, I was not going to take that vaccine. But that colored doctor in the video said, I needed to get that vaccination. And we laughed. But in her mind, it was, for her, that was it. And at this point, whatever it takes, by all means, you know, we need to understand how this information needs to be shared and who needs to share it. And one of the other things that I want to say is this: it is so important that we are in science, that we're in science fields. We need to pursue, it's important that we're here today. It is so important that we are here today. It is important that we're mathematicians. It is important that we're engineers. It is important that we're doctors. It is important that we're nurse leaders, physician leaders. It is important that we are in these fields. It matters. Andrea said, I said the same until I continue to do research. Yes, I even created a video. Awesome, I love to see it, to share. I'll look it up on YouTube to share my experience after receiving the vaccinations. Awesome. All right, Harriot says, can you share with us the information data that you researched? Absolutely, to allow you to change your stance on the vaccination. I can. Any other questions, comments, disagreements? I have a thick skin. Yes, Taylor, unmute yourself, please.
All right, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. So I had a quick question, kind of as we move forward, really thinking about these variants of concern, especially if it becomes necessary for to start thinking about booster vaccines. You know, I feel like we've already really asked people to put a lot of public trust in initial vaccination. So what are your thoughts? Can I hear some of your thoughts about how we ask people to take that leap of faith again with a booster vaccine? You know, would that hurt public trust at all? And how do we be cognizant of that in the Black community going forward?
I think it's going to be a matter of we have to be honest. And we have to be honest from the very beginning. We have to communicate the data. We have to, and I'm going to be truthful. I think that we have to do our homework and we have to do our research, but I think it's almost an expectation. I honestly think they're waiting for it. So I think the sooner that we get in front of it, the better. And I think we just have, again, we have to communicate. This is where, like I said, we have to communicate with people that there were just so many things that are not known. And that is a part of science. That has been this large discomfort in that the science has been playing out almost in real time, because we have been learning about a lot of this as we go. And we need to really share that and be honest about that, that this is something that is evolving, changing, growing. We're still doing research. We are still doing experimentation. We're still testing. We're still doing trials and sharing that information as we go. Over communication is really critical at this moment. And we need to get ahead of it. We need to get ahead of it and not let it get ahead of us. And as Thierry said, not let the propaganda get ahead of us. So if we over communicate, I think it will be more appreciated than if we try to hide it and then we wait to the last minute and then spring it on people. I think there'll be more resentment, and there'll be more conspiracy theory, there'll be more propaganda, and there'll be more resentment. Gabrielle, Dr. Fernandez said, how can we deal with misinformation in our community? That's a great question. I think one of the ways that we deal with that is, one of the things that we need to do is that we need to arm our community with the information. We need to put the information in their hands. We need to identify the official leaders in our communities and then those unofficial leaders. And we need to give all of them the same information. I heard Nick actually share some information. And like I said, we need to make sure that we're all armed with the same information, and there needs to be a single source of truth. And then we need to equip our communities, all the leaders, unofficial and official leaders in our communities, with the same information. Okay, one more question. Brittany says, has there been any more research done available in terms of pregnancy and the vaccine? I do know that there is a current study that I do know of where there is more research being done around, specifically around women and the vaccine, and included in that are pregnant women and the vaccine. And that is something that I would certainly be willing to share with you. And Brittany has oh my goodness, I'm trying to find the right words, but she's a doula in New York. And so I know that's something that she's very passionate about. So I will definitely share that research, that body of research with you. So again, like I said, arming all of our community and those official leaders and unofficial leaders with information, with the data, with the science, so that we're all equipped. So thank you.
Okay. Well, hello, everyone. This is now the Building Trust in Science Communication panel. I am your humble and obedient moderator, Jaye Chapman. So welcome. I'll be asking our wonderful panelists here to speak about not only their experiences in SciComm, but how they interact with Black and underrepresented communities. When we have about 10 minutes left, we'll take questions from the attendees. Feel free to unmute or drop your questions into the chat at that time. And up until that time, you can also drop your questions in. I'll try to get to them when we get there, or again, once we get there, you can also unmute. But with that said, I will now introduce the panelists. So first, we have Harriot, who is a biochemistry and molecular biology PhD candidate at the University of Maryland School of Medicine, and she's also the chief of community development at Vanguard Conversations with Women of Color in STEM, or Vanguard STEM for short. We also have Dr. Reyhaneh Maktoufi, who received her PhD from the Media Technology Society program in School of Communication at Northwestern. She's also a civic science fellow at PBS Nova, producer of the Story Collider podcast, and has also worked as a workshop facilitator and organizer for ComSciCon Chicago. We also have Dr. Jaye Gardiner, who received her PhD in oncology and cancer biology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and is currently a postdoc in Dr. Edna Kickerman's laboratory at the Fox Chase Center in Philadelphia, my hometown. And she's also an instructor in the team research internship program initiative trip through Fox Chase. She has been part of the leadership team for ComSciCon. She's the creative director of Unique Scientists and is the co-founder of JKX Comics. And LaNell will be joining us soon, and she's a PhD candidate in physics at Harvard University, and also a founder of Women of Color Project and a speaker at TEDx Beacon Street. So with that all said, we'll now get to the questions, starting with Anicca. Can you give us a more detailed introduction of yourself and be a little mindful of the fact that we have other panelists, and then I'll popcorn to our next speaker.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So as Jordan mentioned, my name is Anicca Harriot. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Maryland School of Medicine, and my specialty is muscle biology. But I also work as the Chief of Community Development with Vanguard STEM, which is an organization that is all about centering the experiences of women of color in STEM at all stages, also non-binary people of color in STEM. So with that organization, we provide all sorts of resources and opportunities to join together in community to talk about the challenges and experiences and expertise that only exists within the community of women and non-binary people of color. So recently for Vanguard STEM, we did a show. We have a monthly live web show that we recently started hosting on our YouTube channel, although it has been around for about 5 years now. And we did a show on COVID-19 where I gave a lot of the background with the special eye towards the questions that I was hearing a lot within our community about what COVID is, how viruses work, and how vaccines work. And with that, I was also really, really thrilled to be able to invite my mom on as our guest expert. My mom is a Navy nurse, and she recently came back from a deployment with FEMA where she was vaccinating folks out in Queens, New York. And that site was specifically located in Queens to reach the communities there that would not necessarily have as great access to the vaccine. And so they vaccinated about 3,000 people per day, and they reached about 250,000 by the time she came back from her deployment. So it's a little bit about me and the work that I've been doing around COVID lately.
Sorry about that. Dr. Maktoufi, could you give us a little bit more detail about yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Reyhaneh. So I'm currently a civic science fellow at PBS Nova, and I do work in misinformation, but that means a lot of different things. Basically, I did my PhD in media technology and society, but my focus was on science communication, especially how to get people to be curious about science, how to build trust with the public, especially when we talk about things like climate change. This was post-COVID era, so climate change was a big thing we were all talking about. And now as in my position at Nova, I think something that's very important is that there's this whole community of science communication researchers, right? And they study who's our audience, what kind of messages should we come up with, how should we talk about COVID, climate change, all of these different things. And then there's this whole community of media producers that are doing the actual work of science communication. And there seems to be a little bit of gap between the two of them. They don't really talk with each other. So some of the things that I'm doing with my colleagues here at NOVA and other communities that are involved is trying to build those bridges and bring more of the research in media and connect more of the media producers with the researchers. So some of that is the research I'm doing, seeing, okay, what are the strategies media producers are using? What are their goals? Do they work with science communication researchers? But another part of it is producing media with this idea that we know during COVID time, everyone became a science communicator, right? Like you talk to your brother, your sister, your neighbor, you are actually doing the work of science communication. So the same way we're talking about the content of science, about what is actually climate change, COVID, vaccination, all of these different things, we should also talk about the science of science communication. So how do you as a person build trust with people around you? How do you message things? How, if you're making a data visualization, how do you do that best? So one of the ways we wanted to do that was through a series that I produced with my co-producers, a co-producer on SMS, who is not here. But it was basically a show to introduce strategies that are evidence-based about science communication. We called it Sciencing Out, even though it's about women in science communication, with the idea that, you know, there's all these shows with all the white men on it about physics, but the name is not white men in physics or like white men in black holes or something. So we decided we're gonna make this Sciencing Out, but we're highlighting women in science communication, especially with a focus on women of color and the ways they're doing the strategies they're using, from trust building to public engagement to data visualization.
Good stuff. Thank you. I'm going to popcorn to Dr. Jaye Gardiner. Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, so hi everyone. Very happy to be here. It's actually my first time on the other side for ComSciCon as opposed to being an organizer, so this is kind of interesting and fun. But like Jordan mentioned before, I got my PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. There I studied HIV, so my background is actually as a virologist, even though I was in the cancer biology program. And it's kind of during that time that I sort of fell into what science communication was, just with some peers and realizing how boring science could be. If you asked any of the people that were in my program, they kind of started to place bets on when I would fall asleep during our department seminars, just because it was that routine. And so me and some of my friends, we wanted to try and make it more lively, more engaging, not just for our peers, but starting younger and showing everyone sort of what's possible in science. So kind of for that reason, we do a more visual medium that probably not too many people do, except for maybe Ray, but that's using comics for science communication. So we make, so our group is called JKX Comics, and we make stories that are about people of the past and the present that are scientists and telling their stories. Specifically, we tend to highlight individuals that are historically excluded from science, because the three of us are. So I'm a Black woman, Kelly is also a Black woman, and Qua is a Vietnamese first generation man. So we're part of that demographic, and we really love the idea of comics, because not only can you teach all of these principles and ideas that are hyper relevant to the time, like COVID or vaccines or anything around that, but you could also teach the history of all of those hidden figures that are there and just show the myriad of people that are actually behind science and that make science happen. So we do portraits, like right now we're doing it for Pride Month. We just finished doing it for Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month last month. So we'll do portraits of scientists just to kind of continuously generate content, but then we'll also make more longer comic books telling stories either about different concepts in science or of people that are actively doing the work in a more storytelling fashion.
Thank you. LaNell, welcome. Could you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Yes, hi, I'm LaNell. I'm a graduate student in the physics department here at Harvard University. I'm in their PhD program. And ironically, I've never considered myself a science communicator, but there are a lot of people who consider me a science communicator. So I will take whatever title you attach to me. But I have gotten, I've been pretty involved in a few efforts in the past. One of them being the Women of Color Project, which is a group of us who we host a workshop every single year to provide information about applying to graduate school to URM women. The unique thing about this is our workshops are completely open to the public. So it's completely open access to anyone. You don't have to be a woman of color, but there are specific workshops that are specific to women of color that also happen that only students who are part of that demographic can participate in. I have been very vocal in my department and many of the departments in the past about issues of race, in particular, the physics community, physics culture, et cetera. I, along with Ronald E. McNair's brother, and also Trina Coleman from Hampton University, hosted a panel over the summer about COVID-19 in the Black community specifically, and was able to provide some small amounts of funding to various projects from that effort. And I've been pretty proud to see that. So science communication, I think, is extremely important. I don't want to take, the reason why I say that I don't necessarily consider myself an active science communicator is that I know there are a lot of people who are specifically dedicated to that specific thing. I just stick my nose into things whenever I feel like it's kind of necessary. And yeah, if you have any other questions about the other things that I've been involved in, I'm free to talk about them. Yeah.
Thank you. Former McNair scholar myself, so that's great to hear. So you all have different backgrounds in science communication, or don't necessarily consider yourself science communicators, but how did you get into the projects that you're working on now? And this one's we're going to get a little bit more free flowing, so answer as you feel necessary.
I'm just going to be real. I get into the stuff that I get into because someone made me mad. The Women of Color Project came out of an argument about the number of URM women that were in the physics department. And I was just so teed off that I went out of my way. It was just originally it was supposed to be this really, really chill, document that we send out to students or whatever, but Professor Jenny Hoffman offered some additional funding and it became a bigger thing, and we've continued to do it each and every year since. And so again, it was just one of those things where the idea that Black women weren't interested in physics, Black women didn't have the pedigree to, get into physics departments like Harvard resonated with me because it was the same story that I was being told when I was applying. I was being told I shouldn't apply as well, and I ended up being, one of the very few, the third Black woman to ever be admitted in the department. And I think about how many other Black and brown women are discouraged from applying to the places that they want to go because of this rhetoric and where this rhetoric is coming from and the sort of lack of effort to specifically target this particular group. Now, I know we've seen some changes ever since George Floyd, some changes, that's another story. But I think prior to those changes, there wasn't really any huge amount of effort in targeting these very specific groups. So, I feel like any involvement I've had in DEI work, science communication, et cetera, has been a result of me attempting to hang on to my humanity as much as I could.
For me, getting involved with Vanguard STEM was almost necessary in a personal sense. So I attended a very conservative, white Christian university in undergrad, and that was a very isolating experience for me. And so I turned to social media to find community. And one of the communities that I came across was Vanguard STEM. At the time, I was working at NASA Langley doing social media for a lab there. And so after I completed my internship with them, I came onto the Vanguard STEM team initially as the social media coordinator. And so my involvement has grown since then. And really for me, I think that what drew me to working with Vanguard STEM is this recognition that sort of like Ray was talking about, that as scientists, we may be science communicators out of necessity, but that doesn't make us experts in communicating our science. And so what I really appreciate about Vanguard STEM and the work that they do, or the work that we do as far as science communication and as far as shaping STEM identity and nurturing those things, is that we really do take a literature-based approach and defer to the experts in all of our programming. And so with that, I like that all of our initiatives are very, they're based in causes, as opposed to a lot of things on social media, which can be a search for clout. And so, I like that we are causes over clout, so to speak. And so that everything that we do is not for the retweets or share this flyer or making things large in impact, but to have a depth of impact. And so that's why I've stuck with Vanguard STEM for so long, and really just enjoy working to create those communities and initiatives there.
Like you said, causes over clout. I'm gonna have to write that down, actually. It's really good. Does anyone else want to add to that in terms of how you got involved in science communication?
Yeah, I could go. And just so you know, like, causes over clout is something that like me and two of my friends like constantly say to each other all the time whenever there's that slight twinge of a feeling of when you see things going up. It's like, nope, that's not the reason why I do any of this. I just need to be reminded of this. So, like, we definitely say it to each other. So kudos to you. For me, getting involved in science communication, I guess, was kind of more on accident, but a good kind of accident. And so not so much out of necessity for myself, but in just wanting to make things different from how they were. So just kind of seeing things being portrayed so boringly for science, or, thinking about myself and how I got into science that was just purely by chance and whatever things someone happened to expose me to at the exact right time. So I tried research because someone came up to me after my chemistry class in college and said, "Hey, Jaye, have you ever thought of research?" I went to grad school because my parents' landlord in a small apartment in Chicago had friends that were professors. It's like, "Oh, Jaye, you like science and you said that you tried this research. Have you thought of going to grad school?" And that's not a way that I think people should really be making decisions. So it lucked out for me that all of these things are things that I love and enjoy, but that may not necessarily be the case for others, or there might be something that someone loves so much that they don't have access to. So other than just kind of showing the representation of people that do these jobs, I can also show the diversity of jobs that are there and kind of help others through my hindsight. And so by, even if, folks my age are reading, it's like, oh, like, I can go do these other jobs too, or I can combine other passions with my science, I start to target younger ages just so that they know earlier, like, not so much that they might be overwhelmed with decision making, but that's, I think, a good focus for science communication, especially in a different sense of not just like, oh, we need to get more people into STEM, when it's like, well, the pipeline itself is leaky, so maybe we should fix the pipeline. I just want people to know of the opportunities that are there. So even though it wasn't out of necessity for myself, just kind of through the act of teaching myself how to draw and doing these things, I found that there was a space that could be filled with it.
Yeah, for me, I think science communication was just a way to reconciliate all my different interests. Like growing up, I wanted to be an artist and a poet and everything. And then, so I'm from Iran, and the way it works in university is that, like, at the age of 18, when you take the entrance exam, you have to choose like your career for the rest of your life. Like the field that you choose, like you're gonna go there, you're gonna study that. And I studied physiotherapy. And I loved that. 4 years, worked in a hospital, in a pediatric hospital for a year. And after a while, I was at the time working with a lot of NGOs on like play therapy and art therapy with children who have long-term diseases in hospitals. And I think I realized I really enjoy the part where it's about how to communicate and what is the psychology behind all these things. So I got to do my master's in health psychology, and through that, I started like bringing in more of my interest in psychology and social sciences. And I always was an astronomy nerd. I never got to like study it. So when I was doing my PhD, which was like literally media, technology, society. Like I chose something that has everything in it so that halfway through, if I were like, oh, what if I want to like change what I want to study? I could just like jump between like one of those things. But then I had the opportunity to do an internship at the Adler Planetarium. And that's where I realized, oh, I can move from health communication to generally science communication. So I think for me, it was more like trying to integrate all that multiple interests into a study path where if I want to say, okay, now I want to like work on conservation, now I want to work on astronomy, now I want to work on health related stuff, I could have the time and the ability to do that. But the art part, like the production part, that was kind of a thing that I didn't think could happen. I always liked like making like stupid videos, like Jaye knows, like we do some comics sometimes. But there was a fellowship, it was a filmmaking fellowship. I never thought I'm gonna get in. I applied for it, I got in, and that's where I got to meet some people from NOVA, and we discussed how they are looking for people that study misinformation. And that kind of worked out, and I brought the idea of like making science of science communication more popular. Kind of worked out.
That's dope. That's amazing. So since you guys are all kind of in that realm, how do you structure some of your approaches to not only just communicating science, but also communicating with Black and underrepresented communities?
I think some of the ideas that were brought up before about communicating with empathy and communicating like going to where your audience is great for underrepresented communities, but also it's just good science communication practices in general. So it's, at least for me, my strategy isn't necessarily tailored in the sense of you're a URM, so I need to speak to you a different way. It's you have different cultural values or you have different experiences. I'll use analogies from your experiences that will help make it resonate better with you.
Yeah, definitely. +1 what Jaye said. So one of the videos we were making for NOVA, the second episode, we were going to talk about trust and medical communities, and especially the experiences of people of color and Black people, and the history of things like Tuskegee, and the fact that you can't just expect people to trust you. And I think what I think is important, at least as a Middle Eastern person that is very removed from a lot of experiences that Black people have, is that not mistaking that because I'm a person of color, I understand a lot of the experiences. Like I remember we were like writing the script and I was like, oh, this is something important that we should talk about. Then we asked one of the colleagues who also is one of the producer who is Black, we asked him to look at the script to make sure, like we thought like, oh, this is important to talk about. And we actually mentioned Tuskegee. And he said, don't mention that because this is a short video. You bring that up, you're not giving it enough time. It just feels belittling. Like, I know you're doing that to say like, we are acknowledging this, but it's not working here. And then we try to like write it together. So honestly, like the most important thing as a person who's not Black is just make sure you have other people to look at it and tell you that like, that's not what you think it is. That's at least an important lesson for me.
Yeah, I think that for me, most of my communication has been with respect to my environment, essentially. When, pointing out when we're not in the room, pointing out when we're not represented, pointing out when things might disservice people like me within the department specifically, pointing out when, I love the story that you just told, because I think I'm a part of APS as well. And so on one of the committees there, I think there's this very popular thing that people are doing where, you throw Black on it, you throw BLM on it, you make it Black related, you sprinkle a little Black on it. People are interested suddenly, especially now, and it's exploitative. Whether you want to sort of admit it to ourselves or not, but you are exploiting my experience as a Black person for your own gain, whether it's well-intentioned or not. It is exploitation. So I think for me, it's been, when a department attempts to create a committee and it not include folks that look like me, and pointing out that, whose voice do you want to hear in this room, sincerely, right? Who do you actually want to sort of elevate and like center, in terms of these conversations, and are you giving yourself the time and the space to really digest both the good things and the constructive things and the things that you may not be as comfortable with, that are coming from the communities that may not necessarily be represented in your spaces and in your departments. What are you doing to challenge yourself to not always feel good about the things you're doing? Because again, someone else may come through and say, nah, like this is not okay. Like how many times does that happen? And I often find that people get very comfortable in these DEI spaces and the science communication spaces because they throw these trigger words in here to capture people's intentions and to attempt, in their own way to be supportive. But, are we doing the work to really be inclusive of those voices, allow those voices to shine, allow those voices to be at the forefront? Could someone else who, for instance, was Black written that? Asking yourselves that, right? Why do you have to do it, right? So I think that those are the ways in which I have, within my own environment, attempted to sort of bring up these issues. In addition to, again, whatever committee I'm on, whatever board I'm on, whatever space I'm in, constantly bringing up these issues and pointing these things out.
I think, so one thing that I was thinking of as the other panelists were answering this question is the mode of communication that we use with Vanguard STEM. So small plug, I'll definitely encourage anyone who's interested to go read our peer-reviewed publication, our very first one. But something that we talk about in that paper is the Vanguard STEM persona, which is the way that we communicate over social media. And so we called it a persona because it sits somewhere in between this professional sense of Twitter is from an organization. So for example, SACNAS is a great organization that does really important work. And when you look at their Twitter, there's a very professional sense in the way that all of their information reads. And then my personal Twitter sounds like me, all of my tweets, of course, because it's mine. And with Vanguard STEM, we wanted it to sit somewhere in between because we don't like to say that we serve a community. Like this is our community and we are working in concert with our folks. And so we want to sound like we are who we are. We don't want to change our language to fit a professional version of what a scientist, quote unquote, should sound like. And we also don't want it to sound like I'm talking to folks or our social media coordinator who has a very different way of communicating than I do as a Baltimore native. So we don't want it to sound like you can tell who's talking to you, but we also don't want it to sound like we are changing our language to fit into some sort of box. And so that's something that's really important that I think not many folks consider in their style of communication in some of these realms. And so the language that we use is incredibly important as science communicators, and then also as an organization that is by and for scientists. So that's really important. But more specifically, with our work on COVID, something that had become very apparent to me in science communication and the way that we talk to communities of Black people or anyone really, is that we have to acknowledge that there's agency that those folks have. And so with our COVID work, we weren't encouraging people to go out and get vaccinated. We never said, go get your vaccine. We wanted to communicate in a way that was answering the questions that folks might have had about vaccines so that they could make the best and most informed decisions for themselves. So we talked about the side effects. We talked about what was not known and what that meant, and that there wasn't some sort of big black box. One thing that I personally heard very often and continue to hear is, oh, it's a new vaccine. It hasn't been tested. No one knows what this thing is going to do in your body. And so in our show, I addressed that specifically and walked through the timeline of the development of mRNA vaccines, specifically to say that this has been a thing that scientists have been working with since the 90s, that folks have been receiving mRNA vaccines since the early 2000s and things like that. So it wasn't talking at anyone. It's acknowledging the knowledge that they already have and where those gaps may be so that they can make better and more informed decisions, rather than considering myself as someone who knows what's best for you as a scientist and is going to tell you what's best for you.
All great points, and just so many questions flowing from them, honestly. And also, Dr. Gardiner put something in the chat. Science communication isn't about persuasion. You're helping others understand information plus 100. Yes, definitely. And there's also a link from Dr. Maktoufi. And hearing some of those last points, there was someone said something about finding your style of communication. When did you guys kind of like figure out that style and figure out how to interact with that? Because it's in science, we're supposed to be objective, right? But that usually means that we don't get to plant ourselves in it. And I think that's kind of what this conversation is too, is like, how do we, as part of these underrepresented communities, plant ourselves in that and still not lose ourselves? So when did you guys start figuring that out and becoming really comfortable in doing that?
I think for me, I wouldn't necessarily, I guess, so I want to put out there, I guess this is a general question. We're talking about science communication because I know that there's like the larger organizations specifically that are getting information out there. There's also science communication, for instance, like to smaller groups, specific community. If you're sort of doing more grassroots work, I think for grassroots work, specifically when you're trying to make a direct impact on, for instance, like high school students, or for instance, I have a wonderful friend of mine, Dr. Nia Amara, who runs a agency that does this kind of stuff for high school students. She tutors like URM high school students, very much a grassroots organization. And the sort of communication that is like used with that organization specifically is a bit still professional, but a bit less like formal, and it's more down to earth and more geared towards like, we just want these like high school students to get excited about science from where they're coming from specifically, right? And so she focuses specifically on kids who come from very low income areas, et cetera. We've tutored these kids, and whenever we're interacting with these kids, I wouldn't necessarily say there's a semi-professional tone or, there's a, officially like a professional tone. We're really just trying to relate to these kids and relate to these people who are in these communities. So I wanted to put out there that it might depend on like the impact you're trying to make, whether or not that's more of a grassroots, sort of direct impact, whether that is sort of I have a specific brand that other people are going to see kind of impact. And I think that will influence the way in which you sort of, use yourself. So when I'm working with Chiquita, it's, you know, a lot less informal. If I'm working with the Women of Color Project, still more on that side, because again, this is more grassroots work. If I'm working with, so I'm on the board of APS and also on the council, much more professional in terms of the information that's being sent out to people. So it depends on, like, I guess, whether or not the brand matters as much to you, depending on what your work is. So I think that for me, I've allowed myself to kind of flip-flop between, you know, the different personas that you can put on based on who I'm trying to impact and what audience I'm speaking to. So if I'm, again, at a board meeting and we got to get something out to, you know, the graduate student community or something like that, then that language is going to be much, much different than if I'm just trying to, like, help students, you know, directly. So.
One thing that you said, Jordan, that really just kind of sparked thought with me was this idea that scientists are supposed to be objective. And again, this is something we talk about in our paper, but what does that really mean? When we talk about objectivity, it's kind of this view from above a situation to take yourself out of it. And I don't think that that's really conducive to producing the best results. And it's also typically a very white, heteronormative approach to take all of these biases exist, even when you consider objectivity and you're labeling it as being something that is separate from, but it's truly just participating right back into that system. And so I think that the best way to approach that sort of scientific communication is to acknowledge those biases and lay them out on the table. To host a session about combating COVID within Black communities, that's a bias, but that doesn't mean that the outcome is not more equitable than a quote unquote unbiased approach, because the unbiased approach would be combating COVID, period, and without taking into account the inequities that exist in how vaccines are distributed or communities are impacted by COVID. And so I think that in our communication, we can lay that out, and in our approach to science in general, that it's important to consider those biases, because in addition to communicating what it is that we care about, it also acknowledges our own situated knowledges, and particular, it acknowledges our situated knowledges, which is our lived experiences, as part of our expertise. So I have expertise in communicating with Black communities as a Black woman, as a queer Black woman. That's part of my expertise. But that's also part of my biases. And we call that the intersectional scientific method in our paper. But I think that that's really an important way to make the best and most powerful impact in whatever work it is that you're doing. Because at the end of the day, it's how we do science anyway. We're doing these things because we have care, because we have biases, because we have specific knowledges and expertise. And so why would we want to dismiss that in favor of the standard quote unquote objective approach to science?
So I think there are two things that kind of made me find kind of my own voice, and definitely also just echoing what LaNell said about how that voice is very much something that you have to consciously decide which voice do I want to choose today. But generally something that has happened is that I always just wanted to make like poop jokes, and I would not do that 5 years ago. And the more I go higher up in my career, I feel more comfortable being me and be like, I'm a person that makes poop jokes. And now at Nova, there's a whole like game design where there's an alien and it's a fart alien, and I do the voiceover. So like, that's all I ever wanted in life. So that's one thing, is just like that level of comfort that I start like feeling, to be able to be like, I'm a person that makes poop and fart jokes, but about science communication. The other thing, if I can have a minute to dissect trust based on research, can I do that for a second? Okay. So the way researchers talk about trust as a feeling of vulnerability, right? Like, it's not just like, oh, I think this person is really good. It's like, no, I think this person is good, has good intentions, and can actually save my life. I will give them the ability to save my life. And to do that, we start putting people in stereotypes. The stereotypes that we think of are two things. One is competence. right? How competent is someone? Can they save my life? Can they develop a vaccine? Do they know what they're talking about? And scientists are really good at showing that competence, right? It's a little harder for women of color. So we have to be like, by the way, I'm a doctor, I'm competent, please trust me. So we have to be very careful how we make sure that people see that competence. And that's a persona we do have to show. The other thing is warmth, that a lot of times they don't train us to do that. And that warmth is when Anicca brings her mother and says like, this is my mom, this is a relationship that we have, right? When Jaye shows all these different scientists and their quirks and their like little stories. So it's all those like warm things that is about feeling that someone is honest, feeling that someone cares for me, hearing people's intentions, hearing people's like weirdness and jokes and humors. And I think one thing that helped me find my voice was realizing that good science communication actually depends on my authenticity and me bringing all of myself to the story with my weirdness, with my family, with my jokes, with my honesty and vulnerability, and telling people if I messed up, I messed up, and talking about it. So it was all of that was kind of a mix of growing in my career and feeling comfortable being vulnerable, and at the same time realizing that vulnerability and all of that is just the way to go.
I'm sorry. I want to co-sign what you just said. Thank you. Because I feel like once I don't know, it hasn't never been in me to like put on the face like 24/7. Like, you know, it's just, I know that there are some people who like have to like keep that sort of like persona, etc. And I think that at some point, and I know I'm like earlier in my career, but at some point it's been much easier to just be able to do the work that I want to do, to be able to be the person that I want to be, to be able to do the science that I want to do and communicate that science, when I was able to kind of like, of course there are consequences, but able to kind of just let go and like let myself be my most authentic self, be vulnerable, etc., have those quirks, etc., and not necessarily you know, again, always maintain a face. It's necessary to maintain that sort of protection. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that, but I just wanted to co-sign something that you said, in that I find that I have been most efficient and like most productive when I was able to relieve that. And when you just stop caring just a little less, you care a little less, you're a little bit more yourself, you're able to do more stuff. Honestly, you're not spending a bunch of brain power, honestly, you know, worried about these other things.
Yeah.
I would love to just jump in and co-sign both of those things. And I would say that like the short answer I would feel for your question, Jordan, of when I felt like I found my voice is when I felt like I had confidence in my expertise.
Yeah, that was wonderful. I have many more questions, honestly, but we're supposed to end this workshop at 3:20, and I don't want to take away from any of the participants. But if the participants don't have questions, I have many. But I open up the floor to the participants. Unmute your mic. If you don't feel comfortable unmuting your mic or even showing your face, then please drop them in the chat, and I will be your surrogate. Okay. One question that I did have was, so hold on, I wrote it down. I gotta make sure I get the wording right. Have you ever gotten any positive or negative feedback from working with any of these communities we've been talking about? And how have you implemented that into your science communication strategies and material?
So that's a hard question, just to put that out there, right? And I feel, so I'm not entirely sure how to answer it. So I haven't gotten negative feedback for what I'm doing, right? But I also, you know, if I truly think about it, there's probably something of just like, oh, that makes sense, right? Like the Black low income first generation college and American woman in STEM wants to increase representation, wants to work with underrepresented communities, wants to be that role model. That makes sense. So I kind of wouldn't expect anyone to give me pushback, because if they did, then that's them literally looking at me in the face and saying that your identity doesn't matter. And I don't think, regardless of the audacity that, you know, some mediocre white men can have, I don't think they have the audacity to say that out loud and to my face. So everything's been positive. But yeah, but for the second half of your question of like how, I guess, influencing or incorporating that into my science communication, I guess I don't do it for, you know, kind of going back to the cause is not clout, like I don't do it for their feedback or for their approval. It's that I find it important and that I could see the need. And so I feel like if you integrate assessment into your science communication, be that like low-key surveys or just, you know, having a happy folder in your email whenever someone reaches out to you, is like, oh, this meant so much to me. Or like, you know, when my students, you know, contact me again, it's just like, oh, I'm going off to college and I had this class and it reminded me of you, Dr. Gardiner. And like, even if it's just those things, just some sort of feedback so that you know that what you're doing is not only meaningful for yourself, but meaningful for your audience, I think that takes precedence over everything else.
I am definitely going to make a happy folder in my email. Great suggestion. I would say that the assessment is definitely the best way that I feel that I incorporate feedback from our audience into recurring Vanguard STEM events, especially. So one of the things that we've done in the past year is to host what we call gatherings, which are Zoom sessions. They're not recorded. We don't live tweet them. And I believe that all of the ones that we have hosted so far in the past year have only been for folks who identify as Black in STEM fields. And at those events, we've done yoga flows, we've had grief counseling, community, like almost therapy sessions where we hire professionals and bring them in. Those are all free to our community. And then we always have a survey afterwards, and those help inform what we do in the following session. So some folks don't connect well with a sort of yoga flow or something like that. That's just not what they do. Folks wanted music, so we incorporate things like that. So definitely surveys are a great way to get to give your audience what they're looking for in your initiatives. But I would also say, just as a word of advice, because I've also definitely received negative feedback, and more times than not, the negative feedback is from folks who are not part of the communities that we serve and are coming with their own phobias and isms and targeting the work that we do. And it can be difficult to deal with that sort of thing, but it comes with the territory to a degree. And it's important to have established well in your own mind and in your work who your meaningful others are. And that really does help combat some of the imposter syndrome and other things that you'll feel when you inevitably receive that negative feedback. And to be really clear about who those meaningful others are, as well as who they should be. So, for example, a friend of mine has a PI who is not the best person. And because of who she is and the identity that she holds as a scientist and as an individual, she finds herself clashing with him a lot and facing a lot of imposter syndrome. And so one of the things that we talk about is if this person doesn't know who you are and they don't care about the work that you do, why should you let their words inform how you feel about the work that you do, right? Why should they be allowed to hold that space in your work? And so I would say that about the negative feedback, which is, it can be difficult to do in the moment, but it's an important thing to do in your approach when you're going out.
If I can talk about, like, there's also this space like between positive feedback and negative feedback, which is like when you get no feedback, which is that weird place where you're like, oh, first of all, that is not the response that I expected. And it also makes you, like me, realize that I didn't do that evaluation that Anicca was talking about. Like, you need to have a plan for your evaluation. And sometimes, like, especially SciComm work could be so overwhelming that you just want to execute the project. And then when everything is done, the project is done, everything stops, and then you're like, oh, I have no idea how that was. And it's just such a weird space to be in. And that's definitely something that has been a lesson for me to try to figure out, like, as much as I do planning for the project themselves, do something for the evaluation of themselves too.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything everyone else said. We've basically like gotten, you know, positive feedback, specifically with like Anicca and the Women of Color Project specifically, even with the Flattening Our Curve forum that we did over the summer. We got a lot of positive feedback from that. I think if I've ever got negative feedback, it was always from more senior people, but that's not my target audience. So I don't really acknowledge the sort of comments if the students that are being helped are happy.
We have a question in the chat. It says, from related question, in your science communication, how do you feel folks who want your time and energy but are not part of your communities, i.e. protecting your time and energy?
So I have this conversation every single year with the Women of Color Project. This is our 3rd year, about why we don't focus outside of Black and Indigenous Latinx women. And I kindly respond, because I said so. Like, you know, as professionally as I possibly can, because I started this as a Black woman. If I wanted to make this just about Black women, I could have done that too. You know, and kind of give them a nice, we have an FAQ page, you know, there's a nice explanation about why we focus on these groups, et cetera. We base it on the numbers, et cetera, blah, 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 blah. On top of that, you all can still see the entire conference for free because it's open to the public. You just don't get the special events, and that's fine. But yeah, I think that you're gonna have those people. You know, I think that like at one point, like last year, we decided to kind of lay low on our Facebook, you know, you can advertise and stuff like that, because we got a lot of like racist comments and things like that from people. I'm a little bit of a wall. When I see those things, they just go right over me. I don't care. But my team, I have to also think about my team. There's like 17 people on my team right now, and they do get triggered by those comments, and they do care about the things that are being said. So like as someone who's leading them, I have to like address those things to try to protect and protect their sort of sanity as well. So we do kind of stay, you know, kind of low on the social media stuff. We do try to, you know, stay kind of, you know, low on like, you know, putting it out too much, so that like, you know, the communities that like are that are not within the demographic we're focused on don't necessarily like get so much. Like we have our partnerships with the various institutions, you know, they all know us. They've added us, you know, on their like waivers for, you know, graduate schools. Like I have what we need. Like we're helping, you know, these students every single year. If my motto has always been, if the 20 to 50 students we bring to our conference, or 100 and so students that come to like the workshops are happy and they get something out of it, and the 100 or so volunteers enjoy volunteering and helping us, nobody else really needs to be a part of this, honestly. You know, if we're doing the work that we really want to do. Of course, you want to get recognition. Of course, you want to like put it out there. But that comes with the territories. The more you put it out there, the more people, you know, are gonna come knocking on your door, and like you politely have to say, "Because I said so." So and leave it at that, and then, you know, stick some, you know, legal references there and definitions and all those other things about why you can do what you can do, but they just stay mad. That's been my experience.
I kind of actually just recently dealt with this for a project that I'm finishing up where I made a series of comics and trading cards that were being used in middle school classrooms, but it was focused on conservation because it was in partnership with someone that's at Cabrillo, and that's what the students were learning. And well, I was angry for a lot of reasons, but someone found my email, called me Miss Gardiner, which is like, you could find my email, but you can't find my title. Okay. But had asked about, they're like, oh, I saw your trading cards, like they're lovely. I would like to nominate my daughter for your project, her adult doctor daughter she was writing to me about. And I just replied to that this morning and was just like, hey, thanks for your excitement about the project. I'm glad you're enthusiastic, but the focus was on conservation. Like that is the theme of all of the women that I have highlighted. And your daughter is not currently that. If we receive more funds to continue or expand this project, then I'll forward the name on. Right? Because a lot of it is also just like, you're not paying me, so why should I be doing the things that you want to see when also you're not the audience, right? You want the clout for your daughter, but that's not my cause. So just kind of going back to that exact same theme, right? Just knowing your mission and who your audience is.
And being unapologetic about it.
So with Vanguard STEM, this is a territory that we have to tread very lightly. So Vanguard STEM is the signature program of the Search Foundation, which is a not-for-profit. So legally, we cannot say you're not allowed in this room or don't come here or whatever if you're not Black, Indigenous, woman, or non-binary person of color. We cannot say that. But we do make it very clear that our organization is one that centers these folks. So for example, with our gatherings being for Black professionals, one of them, or Black folks in STEM, we advertise them as such, and then we include that language in our registration forms, and we point folks, there specifically is a box that you have to check that says, do you identify as X, Y, and Z? And if you check no, then the form routes you and says, awesome, here are ways that you can contribute or learn more about Vanguard STEM. So there is that caveat. But also I would say that there is a distinction between folks who want access to these spaces that we hold as brave spaces or safe spaces, just to sit and maybe have like a weird type of voyeurism. There's that. And then there are folks who are completely well-intentioned, who find our organization and are like, well, how do I help? What can I do? I know this is not for me, but what can I do to support? And so in that sense, here's the link to our PayPal. Here's the link to our resources about the experiences that graduate students who are women and non-binary people of color are having, and how you can be a better mentor to them, or you can open these doors and those sorts of things. So it does really also depend on the type of access or answers or whatever that folks are looking for, because some really do have the best intentions and might be a little misguided or just want to know what they can do, and some just feel like they want to participate in the oppression Olympics.
Yeah, Anicca brought up a very good point, especially with respect to 501c3 stuff, especially when you're applying for grants. So it depends on the grant as well. So the first year we did this, we had to be kind of like a lot more open. So you guys should like really look into like the laws and like what foundations you're specifically under. We have a very specific grant that we're running under, and Harvard is our fiscal sponsor specifically. And so we're able to do that because the programs that we're under are specific to these like specific groups. If you have private money, specifically, like you have a lot more ability with that. So if you are doing this kind of work, just make sure that like you understand what the rules are specifically for you, and make sure that you have that together before you start, pushing people away. I do agree, but you do have the right to close off folks depending on who's funding you. And so if you're in that position, then you have a lot more flexibility.
Yeah, I will add that we do have terms of engagement for our community, and we mention them at the beginning of everything. And then we end our terms of engagement with, that black button does work and we will use it. And that's legal. So.
Okay, so do we have any more questions from the audience? Okay, so we are a little over time now. Where can everyone find you guys?
I get a lot of emails. So I'm probably the least inundated on my Instagram, and I'll put it in the chat.
Yeah, it's probably better. You guys can put all of your hashtags and social media usernames in the chat. That's probably better. But I think we're pretty much up, right, Taylor? Yeah. Well, you guys are amazing. I wish I could ask you more questions, but I guess I can't. So, all right. Thank you everyone for asking questions and participating. And of course, thanks to our panelists for giving us their time and sharing our stories and experiences. It was amazing. I thank you guys so much.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah,
Thank
thank you.
you.
Thank you.